The Zyrex students arrived on Earth with great anticipation. Their ship descended through the atmosphere with precision. As they approached the research facility in a remote part of the planet, no human eyes had seen them land, and no one knew they were there, but soon they would make their presence felt. Their mission was clear. They had studied countless species from the furthest reaches of the galaxy, but humans were still an enigma. The creatures of Earth were strange to them. They were not the strongest nor the fastest, but there was something about them that made them curious, something that defied simple classification. The Zyrex students had spent months preparing their research, and now they would test the human limits of pain tolerance to understand how this species endured the hardships of their world. Zrax, a young and ambitious student from the planet Zyrex, was among the first to disembark. He had always been fascinated by humans. He had studied their biology in detail, their fragile-seeming form, yet their capacity to survive and even thrive under pressure. He was eager to get started and prove that Zyrex could understand all things through logic and science. The research team made their way into the facility where a group of human volunteers waited. Each volunteer was carefully selected for their physical and mental strength. They were told nothing of the true nature of the experiment. Instead, they had been promised generous rewards in exchange for participating in a series of harmless medical tests. The humans had no reason to suspect anything unusual, but the Zyrex students knew what they were about to witness would be extraordinary. The tests began with a series of simple physical challenges. The volunteers were asked to endure heat pressure and mild pain. The Zyrex students observed intently, recording each human's response to these stimuli. They had expected to see discomfort, cries of pain, or signs of weakness. But what they saw instead was puzzling. The first volunteer, a man named David, stepped forward and placed his hand on a heated surface. His skin reddened and blistered, but his expression remained calm. He did not scream or pull away. He simply stood there for what seemed like an eternity, until the experimenter signaled for him to remove his hand. Only then did he flinch slightly as the heat was relieved, but there was no sign of the breakdown the students expected. Zrax stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. This was not what he had anticipated. The human seemed to show no fear, no sign of distress. This was unlike anything he had seen before. The other students exchanged confused glances and began to take more detailed notes. Perhaps they had underestimated human endurance. Perhaps this would take longer than expected. The next volunteer, a woman named Clara, was subjected to a different test. She was asked to endure increasing pressure from a mechanical device designed to compress her body. The students had seen other species crumble under this test, but Clara stood firm. Her body trembled slightly, but her eyes remained locked onto the device, as though it posed no real threat to her. She whispered something under her breath, perhaps a mantra or a coping mechanism, but the Zyrex students could not tell. They had no concept of how a species could endure such suffering without breaking. They had expected humans to collapse, to surrender to the pain, but instead these creatures seemed to rise above it. Zrax's discomfort grew with each test. He had seen species break before, but these humans were something else altogether. They were not like the others. They endured, they resisted, and their resilience only deepened his confusion. He was beginning to question the assumptions he had brought with him from Zyrex about pain and suffering, and what it truly meant to survive. The Zyrex students moved forward with their experiments, undeterred by the oddity they had witnessed in the first round. The results were puzzling, but they had only begun to scratch the surface. Their data was still inconclusive, so they decided to escalate the tests far beyond what they had initially planned. They were determined to break the human will, to measure the true limits of their pain tolerance, and prove once and for all that their understanding of biology and endurance was superior. They had never encountered a species like this before, but their determination drove them to push further. Zrax stood in the observation room, staring at the monitor displaying live readings of the human volunteers' heart rates, muscle responses, and neural activity. His colleagues were setting up the next round of tests, using equipment that would subject the volunteers to extreme conditions. First up was a test of temperature designed to test their tolerance to freezing cold. The humans would be placed inside a chamber where the temperature would drop rapidly to sub-zero levels, and the Zyrex students expected to see signs of distress. Within moments, they had seen other species react violently to such conditions. Their bodies would convulse in an attempt to generate heat, But the humans on Earth were different, weren't they? The first volunteer was a young man named Ethan. He stepped into the chamber with a quiet resolve. He was instructed to remain inside for 10 minutes as the temperature dropped to its extreme levels. The Zyrex students watched his vital signs, closely expecting his body to react. But instead, Ethan stood still. His breath formed clouds of mist in the freezing air. But his posture did not falter. His face remained composed. Not a single muscle twitched in discomfort. Zyrax's brow furrowed as he observed the data. His heart rate remained steady. His body temperature did not plummet as expected. Instead, it appeared as though his body had adapted to the cold. His movements remained calm and measured. When the test was complete and Ethan exited the chamber, he showed no signs of the frostbite or severe cold damage. The Zyrex students had anticipated. They were stunned. No one had ever reacted like this before. The next test was even more extreme. A pain induction through the application of intense electrical current. The Zyrex students had used this method on other species and had watched as the subjects writhed in agony, their muscles convulsing as they fought to escape the pain. But this time, when the current surged through the volunteer, a woman named Layla, she simply closed her eyes and steadied her breath. The students waited for her to collapse in pain, but she didn't. Her body stiffened in response to the shock, but she remained composed. She did not scream nor show the physical agony they had expected. Instead, she remained entirely focused, her hands clenched into fists, as if to anchor herself against the force of the electricity. After the test ended, the students expected her to fall to the ground, gasping for air. But she simply rose to her feet with an almost serene expression and wiped a trickle of sweat from her brow, as though she had just completed a routine task. Zyrax could hardly believe his eyes. How was this possible? How could these fragile creatures withstand such extreme conditions without breaking? The students had never seen anything like this in their studies of pain tolerance, and yet the humans seemed to be doing the impossible. One test after another, they endured pain and stress, as though their bodies were built for it. Zyrax's mind raced. He couldn't reconcile the data with what he was seeing. Every test he had studied in his life had led him to believe that pain was a threshold that any being would eventually reach. But these humans did not break, they endured. And with each passing test, Zyrax began to wonder whether the very concept of pain tolerance was being redefined before his eyes. The Zyrex students were growing increasingly fascinated, but also deeply unsettled by the humans' unwavering ability to endure pain. Despite the vast array of methods they had used to push their subjects to their limits, the humans continued to surprise them with their resilience. With every test, their data became more and more erratic, forcing the students to reconsider everything they thought they knew about pain and survival. The aliens, accustomed to observing the predictable reactions of other species, found themselves in uncharted territory. Determined to break through their confusion, the students decided to escalate the intensity of their tests even further. They began planning a new round of experiments, ones that would push the boundaries of both physical and psychological endurance. Zyrax, though troubled by the lack of conventional responses, was still eager to find answers. He was committed to understanding what made humans so unique and why their reactions defied expectation. The first test of this new round involved extreme pressure. The human volunteers would be placed inside a chamber where the air pressure would rapidly increase to levels far beyond what any normal species could withstand. This was a test designed to crush and compress, to put intense strain on their bodies and minds. The Zyrex students were certain this would finally expose the breaking point of the human form. The first volunteer, a man named Thomas, stepped into the chamber, and the door sealed behind him. As the pressure began to rise, the Zyrex students could see the strain it was causing on the monitor. His heart rate accelerated at first, but then something strange happened. Instead of the expected panicked breathing or collapsing body, Thomas steadied himself. His posture became more rigid, as if his body was adapting to the change rather than succumbing to it. His muscles tensed, but only in an almost controlled manner, as though his body was locking into a new state of equilibrium. The students had anticipated hearing his cries or seeing him fall, but nothing came. He simply closed his eyes and seemed to focus inward, breathing slowly and deeply. The pressure continued to increase, and still, Thomas stood firm. Zrax's eyes widened as he observed the data. Thomas's blood pressure was spiking, but there was no sign of panic or distress. The readings were simply not aligning with anything Zrax had ever studied. After the test concluded, Thomas exited the chamber with a look of quiet concentration on his face. His body showed signs of strain, but there was no sign of the collapse or injury the Zyrex students had expected. It was as if he had found a way to adapt, to become one with the pressure, rather than fighting it. Next came a psychological test designed to test the limits of emotional pain. The Zyrex students decided to push the boundaries of what humans could withstand mentally while simulating the loss of a loved one. The volunteer for this test was a woman named Sarah. The students began projecting an illusion, a simulation so vivid that it would cause even the strongest minds to buckle. Sarah was shown an image of a loved one dying, the emotional devastation of the moment flashing in her mind like a traumatic memory. The students watched her carefully, anticipating tears, sobbing, or perhaps even an emotional breakdown. Instead, Sarah's breathing became steady, and her expression didn't flicker with sorrow or fear. It was as if the simulation had no hold on her at all. She stood still, her face impassive, as though the grief she should have felt simply did not affect her. It was almost as if she had mentally removed herself from the emotional pain, distancing herself from the experience. Zrax leaned forward in disbelief. He had seen species react to emotional trauma in a variety of ways, but never with this kind of detached focus. It was as if Sarah had chosen not to engage with the pain at all, instead observing it from a place of calm. The illusion ended, and Sarah showed no signs of emotional damage. Zrax was beginning to feel a gnawing discomfort in his mind. These humans weren't just enduring pain, they were transcending it. Their capacity to resist both physical and emotional trauma was far beyond what he had ever imagined. It wasn't just that they could tolerate pain. They could somehow use it as a tool for growth or focus. He had to admit it. He was witnessing something truly extraordinary. The more tests they ran, the more Zrax realized that the humans were not just surviving. They were evolving, adapting, and thriving under conditions that would destroy most other species. He couldn't explain it. The data was there, but the conclusions felt impossible to grasp. One thing was certain. Humans were unlike anything the Zyrex students had ever encountered before, and Zrax was beginning to feel that their understanding of pain, suffering, and resilience was about to be radically transformed. The Zyrex students were now deeply unsettled. The humans' responses to pain were growing more baffling with each new test, and the data no longer aligned with their expectations. Zrax had expected to see failure or collapse, but instead, he was witnessing something entirely foreign to his understanding of biology. These humans were not simply surviving pain. They were, in some cases, appearing to thrive under its weight. It was as though they were rewriting the very concept of pain tolerance, turning it into something unrecognizable. Zrax's unease deepened as he began to consider that they had not come to study pain at all. They had come to witness the indomitable strength of the human spirit. The Zyrex students decided to take a more extreme approach, attempting to break the humans both physically and mentally, as they believed this would finally reveal their true nature. They began experimenting with a combination of intense physical suffering and emotional trauma, designed to push the human psyche into the realm of pure survival instinct. The next round of testing would involve a dangerous form of sensory deprivation, complete isolation in a dark, soundproof chamber. The first volunteer, a man named Leo, stepped forward. The students explained that he would be placed in total darkness, with no sound, no light, no touch. The test was designed to induce panic, fear, and isolation. The Zyrex students were sure that within minutes, Leo would experience extreme psychological distress. As the chamber sealed and the outside world vanished, the students monitored his vitals closely. They waited for his breathing to quicken, for the first signs of terror. But the seconds stretched on, and still Leo's heart rate remained steady. As time passed, his body did not betray signs of panic or distress. Instead, his mind seemed to become more focused, as though the absence of all stimuli allowed him to enter a state of heightened awareness. Zrax, who had been watching the test with growing concern, was stunned to see Leo's vitals become calm, almost meditative. It was as if the isolation was not a form of punishment, but a doorway to something deeper within the human mind. His heart rate remained steady, his breathing slow and controlled. The human was not afraid. He was in control. When the test ended, Leo emerged from the chamber, not broken or disoriented as the students had anticipated, but calm, almost serene. His eyes were clear, his posture straight. He had not shown the terror they had expected, nor any sign of the mental breakdown that should have accompanied the isolation. Instead, he reported that he had used the time to clear his mind, to focus inward, and to reflect. The humans seemed to possess a remarkable ability to transcend fear, to find peace in places where others would crumble. Zrax's mind was racing now. Every test seemed to add another layer of complexity to his understanding of the human mind. These creatures didn't simply endure. They adapted, they overcame, and they did so with an uncanny grace. The Zyrex students had been studying pain and suffering, but it seemed that humans didn't just survive it. They learned from it. They grew stronger from it. The next test would involve the most extreme form of physical pain the Zyrex students had devised, a device designed to simulate deep tissue damage. The volunteers would experience intense pressure, followed by an extremely painful sensation designed to mimic the worst possible injury without causing permanent harm. The students anticipated screams, twitching muscles, and the collapse of human will. What they did not expect was what happened next. When the first volunteer, a woman named Megan, was strapped into the device and the pressure began to build, she let out a sharp breath, but no scream. She focused her attention on her own body, her mind seemingly detached from the pain. As the pressure increased, her face remained calm, her breath steady. Zrax could hardly believe his eyes. There was no fight, no panic, no desperate attempt to flee the sensation. Megan simply endured, her willpower unwavering as the device reached its peak. The test ended, and Megan was unstrapped. To the shock of the Zyrex students, she smiled faintly. It was not a smile of relief, but one of quiet satisfaction, as if she had completed a task, not endured suffering. She reported that she had used the pain to strengthen her focus, to deepen her connection with her own body. "It's just another sensation," she said softly. "Pain isn't something to fear, it's something to understand." Zrax's thoughts were in turmoil. These humans were unlike any species he had ever encountered. They didn't simply break under pain, they bent it to their will, made it a tool to build resilience, to test their own limits. The Zyrex students had come to Earth to study pain, but they were now studying something far more profound. They were beginning to understand that the true power of humans lay not in their ability to endure pain, but in their ability to transform it into something greater. And with this realization came a feeling of deep unease, because Zrax now understood that they had underestimated the human race in ways they could never undo. The Zyrex students had entered uncharted territory. With each test, their certainty that they could measure and control human pain tolerance was slipping away. The volunteers, despite enduring an array of extreme physical and psychological trials, not only withstood them, but appeared to emerge from each experience with a sense of growth, adaptation, and resolve. Zrax, once confident in their knowledge and scientific methods, was now questioning everything. He had thought the human body was fragile, prone to break down under stress, but these people were showing him something far beyond survival. They were demonstrating a kind of transcendence. Zrax's unease only deepened as the students prepared for the next series of tests, ones that would combine the most extreme forms of physical and emotional trauma. They had already seen what humans were capable of when isolated and when subjected to pain, but now they would introduce a more complex variable: the psychological pain of choice. They would force the volunteers into a situation where they had to make a sacrifice, to choose between two forms of pain, to see how the human psyche would respond to having control over their suffering. The first test of this kind involved a young woman named Emily. She was placed in a room with two doors, one leading to a mild physical injury, a controlled burn to her hand, and the other leading to a psychological illusion, a vivid hallucination of the loss of a loved one. The Xyrek students presented her with the choice, knowing that this was a test not only of endurance but of mental fortitude. They expected her to recoil at the idea of emotional trauma, to choose the physical pain over the agony of losing someone dear. But to their astonishment, Emily didn't hesitate. She chose the psychological test, willingly walking into the illusion. The students were shocked. The emotional pain of loss should have overwhelmed her, but instead she stood still, allowing the hallucination to unfold. The illusion was designed to mimic the loss of a parent, someone Emily loved dearly. The Xyrek students watched closely, expecting her to break, to collapse in grief, but what they witnessed was something else entirely. Emily's face remained calm, her breathing steady, as though she was observing the illusion from a distance, not participating in it. After the test ended, Emily sat down quietly, her expression soft but composed. She reported that the illusion had been painful, yes, but it was not the kind of pain that could break her. "I've experienced loss before," she said calmly. "It's part of living. You can't run from it, but you don't need to be." It was something they embraced, something they learned from. Drax couldn't understand it. Every experiment, every test, seemed to reveal a deeper layer of humanity that defied the laws of biology he had studied for so long. These humans weren't just enduring pain, they were reprogramming their response to it, turning it into something that made them stronger, wiser, and more resolute. The Xyrek students had come to Earth to study pain tolerance, but they were finding that what they were really studying was the human spirit, and it was far more powerful than anything they had ever encountered before. Drax's confusion and awe grew with every passing test. He had come to Earth with one simple goal: to measure the limits of human pain tolerance. But the humans weren't just enduring pain, they were transforming it into something far more profound. What should have been a straightforward study of physiological responses had become an exploration of the human soul. The Xyrek students had underestimated their subject in every way, and now they were beginning to feel the weight of that mistake. After each round of tests, the students gathered to analyze the results, but the data no longer made sense. Humans were supposed to react to physical pain in a way that would allow for predictable conclusions: writhing, screaming, perhaps even passing out. Instead, what they saw was resilience, calm, and even clarity. The humans they tested were not simply surviving pain, they were rising above it, as if their capacity for suffering had no upper limit. Drax found himself standing at the observation window, staring down at the latest group of volunteers. The room was set up for another experiment, this time combining extreme pain with emotional manipulation. The students had hoped that by pairing a harsh physical experience with psychological distress, they could finally break the human will. They had designed a scenario where the volunteers would feel the agony of intense physical trauma, but also the emotional torment of being separated from loved ones, a loss so severe it would shatter anyone else's resolve. They were certain this would push the humans past the breaking point. The first volunteer, a woman named Ava, was placed in a chamber where she would experience both intense physical pain and the projection of a traumatic memory, the death of a close family member. The pain was excruciating, simulated by a device designed to mimic deep tissue injuries. The emotional trauma was just as intense, with a vivid illusion of her mother's passing playing out in her mind. The Xyrek students expected to see her fall apart, to witness the panic and despair that should accompany such an experience. But Eva did not crumble. As the physical pain began to intensify, she tensed, but her breathing remained steady. She closed her eyes, focusing inward, as though the pain were nothing more than an obstacle to be managed. a challenge to overcome. The illusion of loss did not break her either. The students watched in disbelief as Ava, her face contorted in pain, but her will unwavering, seemed to enter a meditative state, separating herself from both the physical and emotional suffering. She was not reacting with fear, not showing any sign of panic. Instead, she endured. She endured with a calmness that defied explanation. When the test ended and Ava was released from the chamber, she appeared exhausted but resolute. Her body had taken a toll, her muscles tense from the simulated injury, but her face reflected nothing of the devastation the students had expected to see. "Pain is part of living," she said quietly when asked how she had managed. "But it's just a moment in time. It doesn't have to define you." Drax stood in stunned silence. This was beyond his understanding. These humans weren't merely enduring pain. They were transcending it. He had seen species face physical hardship before, but never had he seen one respond with such detachment, such power. What were they capable of, if pain had no hold over them? Were they even capable of breaking? Drax couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't just about pain anymore. The humans' relationship with suffering went far deeper than he had ever anticipated. Their endurance wasn't simply physical, it was spiritual. They had mastered a kind of emotional and psychological resilience that no other species had ever displayed. Pain was a part of them, yes, but it was not their enemy. It was their teacher. With each test, Drax's doubt grew. He had come to Earth expecting to prove the frailty of humanity, but now he was beginning to wonder if it was the humans who were teaching him something. Were they so much more than he had assumed? Had they found a way to turn suffering into strength? The more he watched, the more he realized the truth. The human race had a depth of endurance that no alien species could possibly comprehend. And the worst part was, Drax didn't even know how to measure it. How could they study something so deeply entwined with the human spirit, so far beyond their conventional understanding of biology? Drax finally allowed himself to admit something he had been avoiding. The experiment was no longer just about pain. It was about humanity. And the Zyrex students were facing the humbling truth that they might never fully grasp what made humans so remarkable. As the days wore on, the Zyrex students' discomfort with their research grew ever more pronounced. The humans, despite enduring a seemingly endless array of pain, had proven something that the students were unprepared for, something that struck at the very heart of their understanding of pain and suffering. They had expected to break these humans, to demonstrate that all living things had a threshold beyond which they could not endure, but instead, they had witnessed something that defied all logic. Humans not only withstanding pain, but thriving in the face of it. Drax, who had been the most determined of the students, was beginning to wonder if the humans had evolved past the need to succumb to suffering altogether. The latest round of tests had been the most intense yet, designed to simulate near-death experiences. The volunteers were placed in simulated hazardous environments, extreme heat, deep underwater chambers, and even simulated suffocation, to see how their bodies and minds would respond under conditions where survival was uncertain. It was the ultimate test, one that would either prove or disprove their theories about human resilience. The Zyrex students believed this test would force the humans to finally reveal the limits of their pain tolerance. The first volunteer in this round was a man named Noah, chosen for his physical fitness and mental acuity. He was submerged in a chamber filled with freezing cold water, with oxygen supplies running low, mimicking the sensation of drowning. The students stood in the observation room, watching Noah's readings carefully, fully expecting him to panic, to thrash and fight for air. But what they saw instead was remarkable. Noah's heart rate quickened, but his body did not fight against the cold water or the growing suffocation. His face was calm, his eyes closed in concentration. Instead of succumbing to panic, he slowed his breath, sinking into a meditative state. His body had entered a kind of survival mode, not through frantic movement, but through total stillness, as if he had accepted the situation fully without resistance. When the test was over and Noah emerged from the chamber, dripping with water and chilled to the bone, he showed no signs of panic or trauma. His body was exhausted, but his mind appeared at peace. "I didn't fight it," he explained quietly when asked how he had endured the test. "I didn't try to escape. I just accepted it and controlled my breath. I didn't need to be afraid." Zrax was left speechless. In every test he had witnessed, beings from all over the galaxy have fought against their pain, against their fear, struggling to survive. Yet Noah had done the opposite. He had embraced the fear, the danger, and the pain, and in doing so, had transformed them into something manageable, something he could control. The next volunteer, a woman named Maria, would be subjected to a similar test, a simulated environment of extreme heat, where the air would grow so hot that the body would start to experience severe burns. Again, the Zyrex students expected her to writhe in agony, to attempt to flee the heat, but what they saw was once again completely unexpected. Maria stepped into the chamber confidently, and as the temperature began to rise, she closed her eyes, seemingly unaffected by the heat. Her body's readings spiked briefly as the temperature increased, but unlike any other species the Zyrex students had studied, Maria did not react with panic. She didn't flinch. She didn't scream. Instead, she seemed to move with the heat, adjusting her body as if she were stretching toward it, not away from it. The students' instruments recorded increased levels of stress in her muscles, but her mind, her emotions, remained calm, centered. After the test ended and Maria emerged, sweat trickling down her face, she appeared completely unshaken. "It's not the heat that's painful," she said with a faint smile. "It's how you react to it. Pain only has power if you let it control you. I didn't let it." Zrax felt a deep shift within himself. He had watched countless species endure pain, but he had never seen anything like this. The humans didn't just tolerate suffering. They controlled it. The students had assumed that pain was the ultimate force that would break every creature they encountered, but the humans were different. They didn't fight it. They didn't flee from it. They embraced it, used it as a tool to sharpen their focus, strengthen their resolve, and expand their consciousness. The Zyrex students were beginning to realize that their experiments had been incomplete. They had come to Earth expecting to measure the limits of human pain, but in doing so, they had completely overlooked the most crucial element of humanity, their ability to not just endure but transcend. Pain, for these humans, was not something to fear or conquer. It was something to understand. And in understanding it, they had learned how to rise above it. Zrax could not deny it any longer. The human spirit was not just resilient. It was immortal in its capacity to adapt, to learn, and to overcome. This was no longer an experiment. This was a revelation. And the Zyrex students were left with the humbling realization that they had learned nothing about pain at all. Instead, they had witnessed a profound lesson in human strength, and it was one that would change the course of their understanding of life itself. The Zyrex students were no longer conducting an experiment. They were standing at the precipice of a revelation that had shaken the foundation of everything they had believed about pain, endurance, and the very nature of life. Zrax, who had once viewed humans as fragile creatures, now found himself questioning every assumption he had ever made. These humans, these remarkable beings, had not only withstood pain, they had transcended it, reshaped it, and made it a part of their existence that they could control. They had turned suffering into a tool for growth, a force that did not break them but refined them. The students gathered in the main observation chamber, where they watched the final volunteer, a man named Jacob, prepare for the last test. Unlike all the tests before it, this one would combine both physical and mental extremes, an unrelenting fusion of pain, loss, and isolation. The chamber Jacob would enter was designed to simulate the effects of extreme torture, a mixture of excruciating heat, simulated wounds, and emotional manipulation. The test was meant to push him beyond his limits, to break him in ways no human had ever been tested before. Jacob, however, stepped forward with quiet determination. His face was calm, his eyes unwavering, as he entered the chamber. The students exchanged nervous glances. This was the final test. If he could withstand this, then the students would have no choice but to acknowledge that humans were something altogether different, beings whose capacity for suffering was beyond the reach of any force they understood. As the chamber sealed, the intensity of the test began. First, the heat enveloped Jacob's body, and the students saw his vitals spike. His skin flushed, and his muscles tensed in reaction. The agony was intense, but he did not flinch. Instead, his breathing remained steady, his pulse even. The psychological component of the test followed. Jacob's mind was flooded with the images of devastating loss, the deaths of loved ones, and visions of destruction. The illusion was so real that it should have shattered his resolve. But still, Jacob stood tall, his face resolute. The test continued for what felt like hours, the combination of physical pain and mental anguish overwhelming. Yet Jacob never gave in. His muscles twitched under the pressure, but his will never wavered. His body might have been pushed to its absolute limits, but his mind, his spirit, those remained unbroken. The Xyrex students could only watch in disbelief. It was as if Jacob was not merely enduring the pain, but choosing to face it with strength, as if he were shaping it into something greater. The pain did not make him weaker. It made him more focused, more centered. It was a paradox that defied explanation. When the test finally ended, Jacob was released from the chamber. His body was bruised and exhausted, but his face remained calm, and there was a quiet strength in his eyes that was unmistakable. The students rushed to him, eager to understand how he had endured such a trial. "I didn't fight it," Jacob said simply, his voice steady and composed. "The pain is a part of me, but it doesn't define me. I don't run from it. I use it to keep moving forward." Drax stood motionless, the weight of Jacob's words settling heavily on him. This wasn't about pain at all, was it? It was about something far more profound. The humans had found a way to not just endure suffering, but to transform it into something that elevated them. They didn't resist it. They didn't flee from it. They accepted it, understood it, and made it a tool for personal growth. What had seemed like mere survival had turned into something more, something extraordinary. In that moment, Drax and the other students realized that they had not come to study pain tolerance. They had come to study humanity. And what they had discovered was that humans were not bound by the same laws of endurance that governed every other species they had encountered. Pain was not something they could break. Pain was something they had learned to overcome. Drax turned to his colleagues, his voice soft but resolute. "We came here to study pain," he said, "but we've learned something much greater. We've learned what it means to truly survive." The students nodded slowly, each one processing the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. The data was clear, but the deeper truth they had uncovered could not be quantified by any measurement. As they left the observation chamber, Drax felt a deep sense of respect for the humans they had studied. They had come to Earth to prove that pain could be their downfall, but instead they had learned that pain was only as powerful as the mind allowed it to be. The humans, in their quiet strength and unwavering resilience, had shown them that suffering did not define existence. It was simply a part of it. And as they prepared to leave Earth, Drax understood something that he would carry with him forever. No species, no matter how powerful, could ever fully comprehend the strength of the human spirit. It was a force that went beyond biology, beyond the physical world. It was the heart of humanity, and it was unbreakable.